As a disclaimer, I want to remind folks that the Goosmann Law Firm, at which I practice law, does provide legal advice and opinions. However, the information contained in this presentation is not and should not be construed to constitute legal advice for you or your company. In that regard, you should engage counsel to analyze your particular circumstance. The focus of today's discussion involves the OSHA Emergency Action Plan aspect of emergency response in the workplace. You'll find it in 29 Code of Federal Regulations, Section 1910.38. I'd like to just quickly go through the sub-elements under 1910.38 as an introduction. Under .38 sub A, an employer must have an emergency action plan whenever an OSHA standard and these regulations require. And an emergency action plan, for those of you who know, deals with an employee's response to an emergency situation in the workplace that could involve fire, a tornado, release of hazardous chemicals and substances in the workplace, all of which require employees to move themselves to a location of safety, either within the facility or outside the facility, depending upon the circumstance. The minimum elements under 1910.38 C will be summarized as follows. You are required to have an emergency action plan, as we will discuss, in writing and as trained upon for your employees at the time of hire and annual retraining, but it must include procedures for reporting a fire or other emergency like a chemical release, procedures for emergency evacuation, including the type of evacuation and exit route assignments. Now, keep in mind that as I go through this, these are all aspects that you as a operating facility must train your employees on in order to be compliant with OSHA and EPA regulations. Under sub C3, procedures to be followed by employees who remain to operate critical plant operations before they evacuate must be included in your plan, which I will discuss more about shortly. It must include procedures to account for all employees after an evacuation. The procedures to be followed by employees performing rescue or medical duties, and the name or job title of every employee who may be contacted by other employees who need more information about the plan or an explanation of their duties under the plan. Normally that will be the safety director or person in charge of safety in the facility. The employee alarm system must be in place and operating within your facility that has identifiably distinctive signals to that system so that when it is activated, employees understand the kind of evacuation procedure they must follow, whether it's seeking shelter due to a tornado inside the facility to needing to leave the facility due to a chemical release that might be occurring. Under 1910.38E, obviously training, which I will discuss, is part of the compliance requirements under OSHA and EPA. Furthermore, if you have all the elements in place as an employer, you have to review not only the emergency action plan that you need in writing with new hires during their orientation training, but you need to review the emergency action plan at least annually with existing employees to make sure that they are refreshed on the duties and obligations and procedures that they must follow when an emergency evacuation is occurring. The key point is no new employee really should be placed to work as a new hire unless they have been first trained on what the facility's emergency action plan is. This is a matter that technically cannot and should not wait for a later date regarding employee training, but needs to be covered on the front end of the commencement of the employee's new job. And if there are any changes in a facility regarding emergency evacuation and action, that has to be imparted to all employees and signed off whenever changes occur in that regard. The most obvious question for starters is whether or not you as an employer must have an emergency action plan. What I can say about this is that as a general rule, if you are required to comply with OSHA standards for portable fire extinguishers under 1910.157, or you have a fixed fire suppression system, you must comply with this provision for emergency evacuation. The emergency action planning also applies to employers who are covered by the OSHA standards, such as process safety management for highly hazardous chemicals. That is a PSM type of program that OSHA requires, as well as EPA under the name of risk management plan. So if you are a facility that has hazardous chemicals on site, you will need to train your employees regarding emergency action in response to spills and releases in the facility. That may include having to leave the floor area or the plant itself, depending upon the nature and extent of releases. When developing an emergency action plan, it's a good idea to look at a wide variety of potential emergencies that could occur. Thus, you have to do a hazard assessment of an emergency action plan, and you should do a hazard assessment to determine what, if any, physical or chemical hazards in your workplace could cause an emergency. And remember that if you have more than one work site at any given location, each site should have its own individual emergency plan. The emergency action plan requirements at a minimum must include the following: a preferred method for reporting fires and other emergencies, an evacuation policy and procedure, emergency escape procedures and route assignments such as floor plans, workplace maps, and safe or refuge areas. Keep in mind that when you train employees, they are to be trained on how to report the existence of a fire or a chemical release. What is an employee supposed to do when they see the fire starting, or they are aware that a chemical release of a hazardous substance such as ammonia, for instance, in the workplace is occurring? How are they to respond? Are they to notify their immediate supervisor, who in turn will get on the radio and report the same within the facility, thus triggering the beginning of an emergency evacuation? And what are those evacuation policies and procedures? And employees need to be trained on what routes to follow if and when they are required and have been signaled to leave the floor area or even the plant itself. As an employer, you must have an emergency action plan. It is a violation of OSHA standards to not have such a plan in place, for which you can be cited for serious and willful violations of the OSHA laws. Some bullet points to consider in this regard. Number one, does it have to be in writing, and do I have to make it available to all my workers as an employer? An emergency action plan, it must be in writing and must be kept in the workplace and be available to all employees for review. This plan really needs to be referred to during an employee's training or retraining annually in the subject. An employer with 10 or fewer employees may communicate the plan orally to the employees rather than having it in writing. The emergency action plan training should be performed upon an employee's hire and annually thereafter in writing and maintained as part of the employee's HR file. And this is very important because if you ever have an incident in a facility where someone is injured or may even die as a result of, say, chemical hazard exposure incident where the chemical is released inside the plant, the one thing that OSHA will be doing is looking to see if you have verifiable training signed off to by the employees to prove that you were training your employees and that the employees understood the subject matter and the areas that were covered with them. Number two, what are the minimum elements of an emergency action plan? You have to have procedures for reporting a fire or other emergency like chemical release, the procedures for emergency evacuation, including type of evacuation and exit route assignments. You have to have procedures to be followed by employees who remain to operate critical plant operations before they evacuate. The issue of route assignments and so forth can go as far as where is a preliminary gathering point immediately outside the facility for employees when they have to evacuate the building. And then there's a secondary location that employees would be trained on as to where to go once people have been removed and accounted for while the emergency inside the facility is being managed by others. The procedures to be followed by employees who remain and operate critical plant operations before they evacuate is an important consideration. If, for instance, you're having a release of a hazardous chemical into the ambient air inside the plant, there may be steps that have to be taken while the evacuation is commencing for all the other employees, or maintenance people, or supervisors, or management to shut down critical plant operations, conveyor belts, operating systems. Though if it is safe to do so while others are evacuating, that is a permitted exercise, provided the atmosphere or the hazard exposure to those remaining employees do not necessarily endanger or put their safety at risk. If you're having, for instance, a rather large chemical release occurring at the time, where it's really a matter of seconds as opposed to minutes, those supervising employees may not be able to remain inside the facility to shut down machinery and equipment and operations. They will simply need to evacuate, and that will be the end of the matter for them. You need procedures to account for all employees after an evacuation. That's known as a head count. And supervisors should be trained in making sure that they have accounted for all employees in their area who gather outside the building before removing themselves to a secondary location. Procedures to be followed by the employees performing rescue or medical duties. While normally the exiting of a facility due to a hazardous chemical release, for instance, will normally prevent anyone from re-entering the building, even to perform rescue or medical duties for people that might be trapped inside. Believe it or not, it is a violation of OSHA policy for people who have just evacuated a building to re-enter a hazardous atmosphere unless and until the facility is prepared to implement and carry out a HAZWOP or re-entry process that is very complicated and is separate and distinct from emergency action plans for purposes of evacuation. As part of your written program, you need to name the employees who are to be notified when a release or hazardous atmosphere requiring evacuation is needed. There needs to be a clear understanding by employees, supervisors, and managers who they are to contact when there is an evacuation. You need an employee alarm system of some kind to notify employees that an event is occurring requiring them to leave and evacuate their immediate workplace. That alarm system can be electronic in nature. One can argue that you can have a handheld air horn as the vehicle to deliver the notice of an alarm rather than having an electronic system. You can have pull chains that cause the tooting sound of a train rather than a pure electronic system using pressurized steam. The training aspect of emergency action requires an employer to designate and train employees to assist in a safe and orderly evacuation. What this means is that not only do you have to have a plan in place, not only do you need to train your employees on the details of what to do and the do's and don'ts, but you also have to have practice runs throughout the year to make sure that employees understand in a mocked situation how to proceed and comply with the emergency action plan requirements. You, throughout the year, should review the emergency action plan. And as I mentioned earlier, critical that you train employees from the start, at the beginning of the commencement of their job, as to what is expected of them concerning emergency action and evacuation, including what their responsibilities are and going over any changes in the plan that might occur. You may, as a facility, decide to change the method of alarm notification. You may go from a handheld air horn to an electronic bullhorn sound, and you ought to train your employees on that type of change if it were to occur, as an example. Now, there's a distinction between what I'm talking about today, which is emergency evacuation and action in the event of a hazard occurring within the workplace, versus emergency response under 1910.120, known as the HAZWOP standard. The law does not require a facility subject to these regulations to have re-enter a hazardous atmosphere to save lives and rescue people. If it is a policy of your facility to, in fact, be prepared to re-enter a hazardous atmosphere inside a building that has been evacuated, then you have to also come into compliance with the HAZWOP standard. Now, I'm not going to discuss the details of the standard, but what it means is that once a person leaves a facility due to a hazardous atmosphere occurring inside, that person, that employee, regardless of their status as hourly, management, whatever, is not permitted under any circumstance to re-enter that hazardous atmosphere unless and until the atmosphere is deemed safe to re-enter. You may have an ammonia release in a facility that is exceeding the threshold for exposure to employees as being a hazardous atmosphere, And if an evacuation were to occur under those circumstances, the employees having left the building cannot re-enter. The only re-entry that is allowed is under the HAZOPER standard, where you have an emergency response unit, either from the local fire department or your own in-house trained employees who wear the chemical space suits, and they set up a wash station, and they have a communication system in place, and they've been trained on the hazards to re-enter a hazardous atmosphere. The problem with that system is it's very cumbersome. It's slow to implement when there is a release inside a building, and by that time, most people will be overcome by the hazardous chemical, and people going inside are simply risking their own lives to save folks who may already have passed away from the exposure. So what we're talking about today is emergency response, emergency evacuation as the policy of the facility with no authorization to, quote, re-enter, unquote, the hazardous atmosphere inside the building. There are lots of cases, and ones that I have been involved with in my career, working in the meatpacking industry with ammonia refrigeration systems, where releases of ammonia have occurred in lethal doses inside the plant. Evacuations occurred, but there were at times one or more people still left inside, and management personnel decided to put on a respirator mask and re-enter the hazardous atmosphere for the purpose of saving the life of these stranded employees. That is a violation of the OSHA and EPA regulations concerning re-entry into hazardous atmospheres, for which the facility can or will be fined significant amounts of money for such violations. And it's a common occurrence for a facility to have, quote, good Samaritans, unquote, re-enter the facility without anyone asking them to, because they are concerned for the life of their fellow employees. Now, under OSHA law, if there is re-entry into a hazardous atmosphere, other than compliance with the HAZOPER standard for emergency response, there is a defense that the facility can use if, in fact, they can prove that the Good Samaritan employee had been previously trained, that it was a no re-entry evacuation policy, that there's evidence the employee signed off on that and understood that to be the case, but in defiance of their training and of the company policy, decided unilaterally, without any prodding from anyone else, to re-enter the facility in violation of the law. If a facility can establish that type of predicate, a foundation for training of that employee, it is a defense for the facility if it is ever cited by OSHA or EPA, if an employee should re-enter. Otherwise, re-entry will be a citable offense for which the facility will lose the argument on. And it doesn't make any difference if re-entry into the facility is for the purpose of saving a life or not. Re-entry is prohibited under any circumstance unless it is accomplished through a HAZOPER standard of compliance. I wanted to quickly go over elements of an emergency action plan. This is just a template as an example of what you might expect to have in place in writing concerning a written plan for your facility. And I'll just quickly go through these pages, but because different pages of subject matters can be amended throughout the year, You will normally want to make sure that you have the date at the bottom of each page, so you don't have to rewrite the entire template you've got for your facility as you tweak this page or that page. And please notice that the plans like this, you actually have to identify people who are responsible for monitoring the evacuation process, which is almost always some form of floor supervisor or manager or both. And you need to describe the areas and the names of the people who will be responsible for that evacuation process. You have to identify evacuation routes, emergency exits, primary and secondary evacuation routes, locations of fire extinguishers, fire alarm pull stations, and assembly points for the employees. Now, you'll normally find that there's a map that you have to post in one or more locations throughout the plant that show the paths of evacuation employees are expected to follow in order to exit the floor and the building itself. These maps need to be large enough for employees to read them. They need to be put on the wall locations throughout the facility. And if there are changes in the design and layout of the production facility, you need to make changes in the evacuation route maps as well. People should know at least two evacuation routes, primary and alternative. Your management in the facility need to have emergency phone numbers for contact purposes. And this is notification to the appropriate authorities if and when you have a fire or the release of hazardous chemicals and substances in the facility. Who do you need to contact regarding electric and water and gas and telephone? The types of emergencies to be reported by site personnel, you can include well beyond hazardous release of chemicals or fire, but you may need to understand if there's been a serious accident or injury to an employee in your facility, who to contact from a medical standpoint. And you may need to call 911 and have an ambulance or a rescue unit come out to the plant to service a severely injured employee. You have bomb threats for which there need to be procedures. The Alpha Code concept in terms of what to do if a bomb threat should be received by the facility. And it's interesting to note that in those situations, the immediate response actually is not to evacuate the facility first and foremost. You have to assess the nature of the threat, because evacuation may be the last thing that you want to do until you have taken intermediate steps after receiving the threat to see if in fact it is a serious, credible, viable threat or just a prank call. You have chemical spills and releases. You have situations involving structure climbing and descending. What happens if the facility loses power? And let's not really go there with terroristic attacks. But it is a possibility. With Homeland Security, they require facilities with hazardous chemicals to provide reports and documentation describing their facility and security measures taken. Medical emergency information is part of your program. Fire emergency. All of these are examples that you can pull up in our library to look at if you want to see the type of wording required. And notice the bomb threat checklist. It gets rather detailed. You'll need to train your employees who take such calls to be prepared to fill out such a form with the details. Severe weather, natural disasters. There are times, and I think we all appreciate that evacuating the building is not the thing to do. Employees will also be trained and should be trained on what to do. Most commonly when you have outside adverse weather, severe weather like tornadoes, I think we all appreciate the fact that people know where to go within the facility as a safe room area in the event that there's an actual tornado warning and a impact on the building and facility. Usually floods are not, and earthquakes are not a common occurrence threatening a facility. But if you're down south with hurricanes, you usually know when those are coming and people have been evacuated. Blizzards, same thing. You know, it's not as much a critical aspect of emergency action as it is for fires, outside weather, and chemical releases and exposure inside the facility. Now, on critical operations, as I discussed previously, it will be necessary for certain trained personnel to shut down critical plant operations in the process of having everyone else evacuate the facility. And if it's possible and safe to do so, those people need to be named, trained, and designated regarding this responsibility. Not only being told what to do and how to do it in terms of shutting down critical plant operations, but knowing when to leave even if they're tempted to shut down critical plant operations because of the hazardous immediate exposure that puts their lives at risk if they were to stay inside the facility in an attempt to shut equipment down. And there needs to be training for these people as to who to notify in the event they are in fact involved in this process once they have completed it. More importantly, your employees need to be signing off on all of the training that they receive concerning this aspect of the program for verification. It will cite you if you cannot prove that an employee has in fact been previously trained on emergency evacuation and response. You also find that even if employees are trained, but it isn't signed off to all the time, employees forget the training or they don't remember the details. And by having a documented paper trail with employee sign-offs, you can prove up to OSHA and to EPA what employees conveniently forget when they're interviewed by OSHA and EPA inspectors. One important aspect that is in conjunction with emergency response deals with the notification requirements, especially involving the release of hazardous chemicals in the workplace that prompt an evacuation, an employee evacuation of the facility. And this deals with emergency release and spill response notification requirements under the law, EPCRA, CERCLA, release reporting. Each facility and management need to know that they are to report threshold levels of releases of chemicals into the workplace that are deemed hazardous. And you have your in-house company contacts to whom you have to notify about an incident occurring as soon as it's happening. You also have the National Response Center. You have your individual state environmental response centers and your local emergency planning committee contacts, local, state, and federal contacts where you have to call phone numbers that are retrievable it's public record, but I don't know how well you can see this, but I have a sheet as an example of federal, state, and local contacts along with company contacts that all managers should have in their possession at the plant. And the reason why it's important is failure to make timely reporting when an evacuation occurs of a facility due to a hazardous chemical release is a violation of the law. Each state is different in terms of how soon they need to be notified of a hazardous chemical release that has resulted in an evacuation of the facility. But for federal purposes, that is an immediate need to contact the National Response Center